You've heard about Cold War spies and missile crises, but let me show you the meltdown. For 40 years, the US wasn't just fighting communism. It was interrogating rock bands, panicking over canned food, and treating playgrounds like war zones. This isn't geopolitics. It's a full-blown paranoia parade. Here are 33 moments where fear broke the brakes and reality left the building. 1. The Miss Atomic Bomb pageant. So what do you do when the government is detonating weapons of mass destruction just a stone's throw from your city? If you're 1950s Las Vegas, you turn it into the ultimate tourist attraction, complete with a beauty pageant. Welcome to the Miss Atomic Bomb contest. Young women competed for the prestigious title, which culminated in a photo shoot where the winner wore a swimsuit adorned with a fluffy cotton mushroom cloud. These photos were then plastered on postcards and sent around the world, promoting Vegas as a place where you could watch the pre-dawn sky light up with atomic fireballs while enjoying your breakfast. It was the absolute peak of turning existential dread into a commercial opportunity because nothing screams glamour and fun, quite like the visual representation of a weapon that could end all human life. 2. The atomic-themed cocktails and parties. The obsession with all things nuclear didn't stop at beauty pageants. It seeped directly into American nightlife. Across the country, but especially in Vegas, people would throw atomic viewing parties, gathering on rooftops with drinks in hand to watch the distant mushroom clouds bloom over the Nevada desert. To get into the spirit, bars created the atomic cocktail, a potent mix of vodka, brandy, and sherry, often with a splash of champagne to mimic the fizz of a nuclear reaction. It was the ultimate form of gallows humor. The logic seemed to be, if humanity is teetering on the brink of annihilation, we might as well do it with a buzz. It was a bizarre cultural moment of staring into the abyss and saying, "I'll have another, please," with a radioactive green cherry on top. 3. Backyard fallout shelters. While some were partying, millions of others were digging. Fueled by government pamphlets and terrifying school drills, a nationwide craze for building backyard fallout shelters swept America. This wasn't some high-tech military-grade operation. For most families, it meant a cramped, damp concrete box buried under the rose bushes, stocked with canned beans, board games, and the crushing anxiety of impending doom. The reality was grim. These shelters were often poorly ventilated, structurally unsound, and offered little real protection. But the paranoia they created was very real. It sparked a strange new social dilemma. What do you do when the sirens blare and your unprepared neighbor starts banging on your shelter door? It was the ultimate test of suburban hospitality in the face of nuclear Armageddon. 4. Civil defense pamphlets on washing radiation off food. In a stunning display of what can only be described as delusional optimism, the United States government issued civil defense pamphlets with advice on how to survive a nuclear attack. One of the most mind-boggling tips was on food safety. The official guidance seriously suggested that if your food was exposed to radioactive fallout, you could make it safe to eat by simply washing it. Yes, according to the experts, a good rinse under the tap was all you needed to decontaminate your apples and lettuce. This is the equivalent of trying to fix a shark bite with a small band-aid. It completely ignored the fact that radiation isn't just surface-level dirt. It's penetrating, invisible energy. The government's message was clear. Nuclear winter is no excuse for a gritty salad. 5. Communist plot to fluoridate water. In the 1950s, cities across America began adding fluoride to their public water supplies, a proven public health measure to prevent tooth decay. But to a growing number of deeply paranoid citizens, this was not about dental hygiene. Oh no. This was a sinister communist plot to poison the nation. Right-wing groups and conspiracy theorists claimed that fluoridation was a secret Soviet strategy to weaken the American population, cause brain damage, and make them submissive to a communist takeover. They believed it was a form of mass medication designed to sap the country of its will to fight. The logic was simple and terrifying. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. They were in your kitchen sink, plotting world domination one glass of tap water at a time. 6. the censorship of globes and maps. The paranoia became so intense that it started to infect the very tools of education. In classrooms across America, the Soviet Union's depiction on maps and globes became a major controversy. The problem? It just looked big, dangerously big. School boards and parent groups demanded that publishers color the USSR and its satellite states a menacing blood red to constantly remind children of the threat. But some activists went even further, insisting that maps be redrawn to make the Soviet Union appear physically smaller. The idea was that showing its true vastness was a form of propaganda that glorified communist power. It was a bizarre attempt to literally rewrite geography, as if you could defeat an ideology by simply reducing its font size on the world stage. 7. Fear of subliminal messaging in movies. Imagine sitting in a dark movie theater, enjoying a film, when suddenly you feel an inexplicable urge to overthrow capitalism. In the late 1950s, this was a genuine fear. A panic erupted over the concept of subliminal messaging, the idea that hidden messages flashed on screen for a fraction of a second could brainwash unsuspecting audiences. People were terrified that Hollywood, believed to be a hotbed of communist sympathizers, was embedding secret commands in its movies. The theory was that a split-second image of a hammer and sickle or a phrase like "obey the party" could turn patriotic Americans into mindless communist drones. It revealed a deep-seated fear that the enemy was not only invisible, but could bypass your conscious mind entirely to plant its ideology directly into your brain. 8. The FBI's war on Louie Louie. In 1963, the song Louie Louie by the Kingsmen became a massive hit. It was catchy, raw, and the lyrics were famously completely unintelligible. But to J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, those slurred, nonsensical vocals were not just bad singing. They were a potential threat to national security. The Bureau received letters from concerned parents who were convinced the song's lyrics were either outrageously obscene or, even worse, contained coded messages for communist spies. And so, the FBI launched a full-scale 2-year investigation. Agents spent countless hours playing the record at different speeds, trying to decipher the garbled words. In the end, after a massive waste of time and taxpayer money, they concluded the lyrics were unintelligible at any speed. The nation was safe from the rock and roll menace for now. 9. The Red Fish Panic. The US government had a simple, wholesome goal: encourage Americans to eat more fish to support the national fishing industry. But they hit a bizarre snag rooted in pure paranoia. One of the most popular and abundant fish was salmon, which, as everyone knows, is naturally pink or red. In the fevered climate of the Red Scare, this was a massive PR problem. The word red was so toxic, so synonymous with communism, that people were becoming suspicious of the fish itself. Government propaganda had to work overtime to rehabilitate the salmon's image, assuring the public that its color was a sign of deliciousness, not a secret allegiance to Moscow. It was a moment when political hysteria became so absurd that even the seafood section of the grocery store was a potential front for ideological warfare. 10. Lead-lined survival underwear. As the fear of radioactive fallout reached its peak, a new breed of entrepreneur saw a golden opportunity in the lead market. Companies began marketing lead-lined survival gear, promising protection from deadly gamma rays. This wasn't just limited to sensible items like blankets. Oh no, they went all in, selling lead-infused underwear and clothes. The sales pitch was simple. If the bomb drops while you're out and about, your specially lined briefs could be the one thing standing between you and a gruesome death. Of course, the science was complete nonsense. A thin layer of lead in your clothes would do absolutely nothing to stop the penetrating power of radiation from a nuclear blast. But in an era of pure terror, selling a false sense of security was a very profitable business. 11. The loyalty oath craze. The fear of communist infiltration became so pervasive that the government decided the only solution was to make everyone, and I mean everyone, swear they weren't a communist. This wasn't just for spies or high-level officials. Millions of ordinary Americans were required to sign loyalty oaths just to keep their jobs. University professors, lawyers, factory workers, and in one of the most famously absurd cases, even professional wrestlers had to formally pledge their allegiance. The logic was that a secret Soviet agent would, upon being presented with a form, be honor-bound to tell the truth. It was a massive, bureaucratic exercise in paranoia that treated every citizen as a potential traitor until they signed a piece of paper proving otherwise. 12. The baseball team name change. In the world of sports, few names were as historic as the Cincinnati Reds. But by the early 1950s, that name had become a major league problem. At the height of McCarthyism, the team's ownership became terrified that the word Reds sounded a little too, well, you know. To avoid any association with the godless communists, they made a drastic decision. The team officially changed its name to the Cincinnati Redlegs. For 5 whole seasons, they played under this clunky new name, all so that patriotic fans could cheer for their team without fear of ending up on an FBI watch list. It remains one of the most surreal examples of how deep the Red Scare penetrated American culture, forcing a baseball team to rename itself to avoid sounding politically suspicious. 13. Paranoia over the language of Esperanto. Esperanto was created in the late 19th century with a noble goal: to foster world peace and understanding through a universal second language. But to the ever-watchful eyes of the FBI, this idealistic project looked like a sinister threat. Their logic was a masterpiece of paranoid deduction. If everyone in the world spoke the same language, wouldn't that make it incredibly easy for the Soviets to spread their communist propaganda globally? Suddenly, this small community of language hobbyists was viewed as a potential fifth column. FBI agents began monitoring Esperanto clubs, and its proponents were sometimes interrogated, all because their peaceful mission of unity was twisted into a tool for the enemy. 14. The Children's Crusade for Freedom. How do you fight communism? With pocket money, of course. In one of the era's most peculiar propaganda efforts, the Crusade for Freedom was launched, encouraging American school children to donate their dimes and nickels to the cause. The money was used to fund the operations of Radio Free Europe, and, most visibly, to launch massive balloons over the Iron Curtain. These balloons carried millions of leaflets with pro-democracy messages intended to inspire hope and resistance in Eastern Europe. It was a brilliant move, framing psychological warfare as a wholesome, patriotic activity for kids. Essentially, the US government managed to turn the act of saving up for a comic book into a direct contribution to the global fight against tyranny. 15. The American Legion's Anti-Communist Crusade. While Senator McCarthy was holding hearings in Washington, a quieter, more local Red Scare was being waged by the American Legion. This respected veterans organization took it upon itself to become the nation's neighborhood watch against communism. Local chapters across the country engaged in their own freelance witch hunts, compiling their own blacklists of suspected subversives in their communities. They would then use their considerable influence to pressure local businesses and government offices to fire anyone on their list. They became a powerful, decentralized force of paranoia, ensuring that the fear of communism wasn't just an abstract political issue, but a very real threat to your job and reputation in your own hometown. 16. The John Birch Society's Conspiracy Theories. Just when you thought Cold War paranoia couldn't get any more extreme, the John Birch Society arrived to raise the bar into the stratosphere. This ultra-conservative group believed that the communist conspiracy wasn't just knocking at the door, it had already taken over the house. They saw secret communists everywhere, infiltrating every aspect of American life. But their most famous and reality-shattering claim was that President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 5-star general who led the Allies to victory in Europe during World War II, was himself a dedicated agent of the international communist conspiracy. For them, the paranoia was so absolute that even the most celebrated Republican war hero in the country was a secret traitor working for the enemy. 17. The Lavender Scare. While the Red Scare targeted political beliefs, a parallel and arguably more vicious witch hunt was underway: the Lavender Scare. This was a moral panic driven by the paranoid theory that gay men and lesbians were a threat to national security. The twisted logic was that their secret lives made them inherently susceptible to blackmail by Soviet agents, who could threaten to expose them unless they handed over government secrets. This baseless fear led to a full-blown purge. Thousands of dedicated federal employees were investigated, interrogated about their private lives, and unceremoniously fired, not for any act of disloyalty, but simply because of who they loved. It was a brutal campaign that ruined countless lives and institutionalized discrimination under the guise of protecting the nation. 18. The Hollywood Blacklist. In the glamour capital of the world, a dark drama was unfolding. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, turned its sights on Hollywood, convinced it was a hotbed of communist propaganda. A blacklist was created, naming actors, screenwriters, directors, and musicians who were suspected of having communist sympathies, often based on nothing more than attending a protest years earlier. Being on the list was a career death sentence. Studios refused to hire them, effectively destroying their livelihoods overnight. Some of the most talented artists in America were forced to work under pseudonyms, flee the country, or abandon their craft altogether, all because of a paranoid fear that they were secretly embedding Marxist ideology into blockbuster movies. 19. J. Edgar Hoover's War on Martin Luther King Jr. To most of America, Martin Luther King Jr. was a moral leader fighting for justice. To the powerful and deeply paranoid director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, he was a grave threat. Hoover was pathologically obsessed with the idea that the civil rights movement was a communist plot, orchestrated by Moscow to destabilize the nation. He believed King was either a secret communist himself or was being manipulated by them. Under his command, the FBI launched a relentless campaign to destroy King's reputation, using wiretaps and surveillance to dig up dirt on his personal life and attempting to blackmail him. It was a shocking abuse of power, fueled by one man's conviction that the struggle for racial equality was just a front for the Red Menace. 20. The burning of library books. The battle against communism wasn't just fought with spies and soldiers, it was fought in the quiet aisles of your local library. Across the country, self-appointed vigilance committees and concerned citizen groups began demanding that libraries purge their shelves of subversive material. Their definition of subversive was absurdly broad. Books that simply described life in the Soviet Union were banned. Even the classic story of Robin Hood came under fire because his philosophy of robbing from the rich to give to the poor sounded suspiciously like a communist manifesto. In some towns, this hysteria escalated to public book burnings, a chilling echo of totalitarian regimes, all happening in the name of protecting American freedom from dangerous ideas. 21. The fear of Soviet super soldiers. Forget nuclear bombs. The new fear whispered in intelligence circles was that the Soviets were engineering something far more terrifying: the perfect soldier. Lurid, pseudoscientific reports and sensational articles began to circulate, claiming that the USSR was using a combination of powerful drugs, advanced hypnosis, and brutal psychological conditioning to create an army of human weapons. These super soldiers, the stories claimed, felt no pain, no fear, and no fatigue. They were depicted as unstoppable, unfeeling killing machines who could march for days without rest. While completely fictional, this propaganda fed into the American fear of a dehumanized monolithic enemy, turning the average Soviet conscript into a monstrous product of a godless, scientific dystopia. 22. The Hiller VZ-1 Pawnee flying platform. The race against the Soviets wasn't just for military supremacy, it was for futuristic coolness. And nothing screamed future like the US Army's Hiller VZ-1 Pawnee. This thing looked like it flew straight out of a sci-fi comic book. It was a small, circular platform that a single soldier stood on and controlled by simply leaning in the direction they wanted to go. The idea was to create a nimble, go-anywhere reconnaissance vehicle for the modern battlefield. The reality? It was incredibly difficult to fly, wildly unstable, and completely expose the pilot to enemy fire. After spending millions, the Army realized that a flying dinner plate was perhaps not the revolutionary weapon they had hoped for, but it remains a perfect monument to the era's anything is possible mindset. 23. The nuclear-powered bomber project. Why refuel your bombers when you can just stick a nuclear reactor inside them? That was the brilliantly insane logic behind the Convair NB-36H, America's experimental nuclear-powered bomber. The goal was to create an aircraft that could stay airborne for weeks, even months, at a time, providing a constant, menacing nuclear threat to the Soviet Union. They actually built a prototype and flew it 47 times with an operational reactor on board, shielded by tons of lead to protect the crew. The project was ultimately cancelled due to its astronomical cost and the rather significant problem of what would happen if a flying Chernobyl ever crashed. It was a testament to the era's ambition, where no idea was too risky or too expensive in the quest to one-up the Soviets. 24. Project Plowshare. The US government had a surplus of nuclear bombs and a wild idea. What if we use them for peaceful, civil engineering projects? Thus, Project Plowshare was born, a program dedicated to finding constructive uses for atomic explosions. The proposals were breathtakingly unhinged. They included a plan to blast a new, bigger Panama Canal through Nicaragua using hundreds of nuclear devices. Another idea, Project Chariot, aimed to create an artificial harbor in Alaska by detonating 5 thermonuclear bombs. Thankfully, most of these plans never left the drawing board, after scientists pointed out the rather obvious and catastrophic consequences of creating massive, radioactive craters near populated areas. It was a bizarre chapter where the most destructive weapon ever created was briefly rebranded as a very large shovel. 25. The Survival Condo Project. For the average American, surviving a nuclear war meant a grim existence in a concrete bunker. But for the wealthy, the apocalypse was an experience to be handled with luxury. Enter the Survival Condo Project. Enterprising developers bought decommissioned Atlas F nuclear missile silos, massive underground structures built to withstand a direct atomic blast, and converted them into high-end doomsday apartments. These weren't just shelters, they were subterranean penthouses featuring swimming pools, movie theaters, rock climbing walls, and hydroponic gardens. It was the ultimate expression of Cold War anxiety meeting capitalism. While the rest of the world braced for radioactive winter, the super-rich could ride it out in climate-controlled comfort, proving that even the end of civilization could have a VIP section. 26. Operation Big Buzz. In a move that sounds like the plot of a B-grade horror movie, the US military decided to test the feasibility of using insects as weapons of mass destruction. The experiment, codenamed Operation Big Buzz, took place over a residential area in the state of Georgia. In 1955, the Army released approximately 330,000 uninfected mosquitoes from aircraft to see how they would disperse and if they would seek human blood. The goal was to determine if mosquitoes could be used as a delivery system for a biological agent like yellow fever in a potential war. Naturally, the unsuspecting residents below were not informed that they were the subjects of a massive entomological experiment. It was a chilling test run that treated an American town like a giant laboratory for bug-based warfare. 27. Project Aqualine, the nuclear-powered spy drone crow. The CIA's mission was to gather intelligence on the Soviets, and they were willing to try literally anything. This led to one of the most bizarre concepts in espionage history, Project Aqualine. The idea was to build a reconnaissance drone disguised as a crow or an eagle. But this was no ordinary drone. The plan was for it to be powered by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, essentially a small nuclear battery. This would allow the robotic bird to stay aloft for months, perching on windowsills in Moscow and silently collecting data with its camera eyes and microphone beak. The project was incredibly ambitious and ultimately failed due to technical challenges, but it perfectly captures the era's blend of high-tech paranoia and almost cartoonish spycraft. 28. Project Orion, the nuclear bomb-powered spaceship. How do you win the space race? According to some of the brightest minds at NASA and DARPA, the answer was simple. Ride a continuous wave of nuclear explosions all the way to Mars. This was the core concept behind Project Orion, a serious proposal for a spaceship propelled by atomic bombs. The design involved a massive ship with a giant pusher plate at the back. Small, specially designed nuclear devices would be ejected from the rear and detonated, and the resulting shockwave would push the plate, propelling the craft forward. It was, theoretically, the fastest and most powerful propulsion system ever conceived. The only tiny drawbacks were the massive amounts of radioactive fallout it would spray across the planet during launch and the general insanity of strapping your astronauts to a tower of atomic weapons. 29. Project A119. In the late 1950s, the space race was heating up, and America was lagging behind after the Soviet launch of Sputnik. In a desperate attempt to stage a massive PR victory, the U.S. Air Force concocted a top-secret plan codenamed Project A119. The objective was shockingly simple and monumentally insane: detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon. The explosion would be timed so that the mushroom cloud, when backlit by the sun, would be visible to the naked eye from Earth. It was intended as a global, undeniable display of American power, a way to show the world, and especially the Soviets, that the United States had the capability to project its military might all the way to the lunar surface. Thankfully, wiser heads prevailed, and the plan to nuke the moon was quietly shelved. 30. The domino theory. This wasn't a single event, but a pervasive and powerful idea that shaped decades of American foreign policy. The domino theory was a simple, terrifying metaphor. If one country in a region fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably collapse one after another, like a line of dominoes. This simplistic worldview turned every local conflict, every civil war, and every political shift anywhere on the globe into a critical battleground in the Cold War. It was this fear-based logic that justified American intervention in places like Vietnam and Latin America. The theory transformed the world into a giant high-stakes game where losing a single, tiny domino could supposedly lead to a chain reaction that would threaten the entire free world. 31. Operation Northwoods. This is one of those declassified documents that is so shocking, it's hard to believe it's real. In 1962, the highest levels of the U.S. military, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, drafted and proposed a plan called Operation Northwoods. The plan was a blueprint for a series of false flag attacks to be committed by the U.S. government against its own citizens and interests. The list of proposed actions included staging terrorist attacks in American cities, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, and even shooting down a U.S. passenger jet. The goal was to blame these horrific acts on Fidel Castro's Cuba, creating an undeniable pretext for a full-scale military invasion. The Kennedy administration flatly rejected the insane proposal, but it remains a terrifying glimpse into how far some were willing to go. 32. Project Sunshine, the baby body snatching program. This is easily one of the most disturbing secret projects of the entire Cold War. In the 1950s, a government agency called the Atomic Energy Commission launched Project Sunshine. Its mission was to study the long-term effects of radioactive fallout on the human body, specifically how a dangerous isotope called strontium-90 was accumulating in human bones. To do this, they needed human tissue samples, particularly from the young, whose bones were still developing. So, government agents around the world began secretly collecting body parts, primarily from recently deceased babies and children, without the knowledge or consent of their grieving parents. It was a ghoulish, unethical program that treated human bodies as mere data points in the nuclear arms race. 33. The Doctrine of Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD. And finally, we arrive at the absolute pinnacle of Cold War logic, a strategy so perfectly insane that its own acronym was a confession. The doctrine that kept the fragile peace for decades was called Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD. The The concept was simple. The only way to prevent a nuclear war was for both the USA and the USSR to possess so many nuclear weapons that any attack would guarantee the total annihilation of both the attacker and the defender, and likely the rest of the world. Peace was maintained not through trust or diplomacy, but through a global hostage situation where every human being was a potential casualty. It was the ultimate paradox. To ensure survival, humanity had to live on the permanent brink of complete extinction. The name said it all. The strategy was truly, utterly mad. So, fighting the Cold War by banning colors, fish, and guitar solos. Genius or madness? Maybe both. But here's the real kicker. Would they have won without the crazy? Drop your theory in the comments. And if you love peeling back the weird layers of history, hit like, subscribe, and stay curious.